Good day, everyone. We study Fs1, Episode 11. It is entitled Assessment for Learning and Assessment as Learning Formative. I know that this is not your first time to encounter the word assessment. Assessment in Tagalog is pagtatasa, and it is used in the different field, not just in education. In broader sense, assessment is commonly referred to a systematic process of collecting data based on performance, analyzing, and interpreting of data to arrive at a valid result. So you can see how here the highlighted term process of collecting data, analyzing the data that you have collected, and have your interpretation based on your analysis in order for you to give this valid and reliable result. And now we have to narrow down the definition of assessment in its broader sense to what is it means in the field of education. So it refers to the wide variety of methods of tools that educators use to evaluate, measure, and document progress, skill acquisition, or educational needs of students. In other words, it is the process of evaluating and measuring an individual's achievement, typically done with assessment tools such as assignments or examinations. Now we proceed to assessment for learning. So when we talk about assessment for learning, we're talking about three types of assessments that are done before and during instructions. So first is placement assessment. It is done prior to instruction. Its purpose is to assess the needs of the learners to have basis in planning for relevant instructions. So this is somehow called the assessment of needs or learner's assessment of needs because as a future educator, we must know what we want and what the students needs to learn from us. And teachers use this assessment to know what their students are bringing into the learning situation and use this as a starting point for instructions. Remember that there are different types of learners. So when a learner enter the classroom or enter the class, these different learners have different experiences. So using these placement exams or placement assessments, we can actually determine what are the primary knowledge or of these learners based on their experiences and based on the environment that they live in. So this allows us to determine the learning situation of the learners, of the students. And this can serve as a springboard where we can start or where we can launch our teaching instructions and then followed by the result of this assessment place the students in specific learning groups to facilitate teaching and learning. So before we are still doing clustering of examples and entrance exams on colleges or exams for high school, wherein what section will be distributed, but then again, in the 21st century education, we try not to be discriminating with what the learners want to like. If the learners want to take this program but they fail to this, the placement exams, but hopefully this do not just affect the learners now. Placement exams actually helps learners, but somehow this also leads learners from their deviate learners from their dream jobs or dream programs. Next is formative assessment. It is done during instruction. This is where the teachers continuously monitors the students' level of attainment of the learning objectives. So this is continuous. This is progressive. We don't just check the learner's totality. There's a different assessment for that. But for formative assessment, this is used during the instruction if we can proceed or reteach a certain topic. And the result of this assessment are communicated clearly and promptly to the students for them to know their strengths and weaknesses and the progress of their learning. So, formative assessment is very helpful to the teacher and the students as well. To the teacher, one is that they could decide if they are going to reteach that topic based on the results of the formative exams before they proceed to the next topic. And for the learners, this could be also be helpful because it can help them identify their own strengths and weaknesses and also their progress on their learning. But then again, formative assessments are very important because there are topics of course in teaching that are prerequisite to the next topic. So these assessments allows to the learners to be ready for the next topic. Last is diagnostic assessment. It is done during instruction. So this is used to determine the student's recurring or persistent difficulties. It searches for the underlying causes of the student's learning, problems that do not respond to the first aid treatment. It helps formulate a plan for detailed remedial instruction. So these diagnostic exams allows the teachers, of course, to provide remedial instructions if needed for the learners. We don't just reteach and we also have to do a remedial activity wherein the learners could easily learn from the topic. So that the assessment for learning. Take note the placement, formative, and the diagnostic assessment.
Now let's proceed to assessment as learning. Assessment as learning occurs when students are their own assessor. From the word assessor, the student can estimate, evaluate, or calculate, or even have a knowledge about what they have taught or the teacher taught in the class. Students monitor their own learning, ask questions, and use range of strategy to decide what they know and can do and how to use assessment for new learning. Meaning, the student is independent. They don't need a help for anybody because they can monitor their own learning, ask questions, and use even strategy to decide what they know. And they use this assessment to create or even gain some new learning. Assessment as learning is self-assessment wherein the student given the opportunity to monitor and critically reflect their own learning and prepare the necessary adjustment for their learning. For example, reflection, insight, and reflective journal. Assessment as learning is the highest form of assessment. This is used for students to monitor own learning progress. Function of assessment of as learning. Encourage students to take responsibility for their own learning. It means assessment as learning, they encourage students to take responsibility to gain or make their own learning. Require students to ask questions about learning. So, assessment as learning. If the student is learning, they are required to ask questions. Involves teachers and students creating learning goals to encourage growth and development. Assessment as learning, of course, involves teacher and student to gain or creating learning goals for the development, growth and development. Provides ways for students to use formal and informal feedback and self-assessment to help them understand the next step in learning. Encourage peer assessment, self-assessment, and reflection. And that is the function of assessment as learning.
So take note that in a formative assessment, one must be knowledgeable on the outcomes-based teaching and learning competencies-based teaching and teaching by objectives. In teaching in a formative assessment, you must hit the outcome, the intended outcome, the competency, and objectives pertaining to that topic. As future educator, for me, we cannot immediately jump to another topic if the students fail to understand the initial topic because, as I have mentioned, there are prerequisite knowledge, there is a prerequisite topics that are relevant to the following. So, it has to be established because it will be assessed at the end called the summative. And teachers must ensure the intended outcome, competency, and objectives is attained at the end of the lesson. And so, while still the process of teaching, we have to check the teacher's understanding and progress. So, why did I put while still process of teaching? Because as I have mentioned, this formative assessment is done during and before during. So if the teacher is still at the formative stage, you should address the learning gaps or the problems of the learners prior to before it reach the summative assessments. Because if it reach the summative assessment, remember that the failure of the student is also the failure of the teacher. So that failure of the entire class is a reflection of the failure of the teacher. Answer the following questions. 1. What are the main purpose of assessment? 2. How to use assessment as learning? 3. What are the functions of assessment as learning? 4. How to use assessment for learning? And 5. Is there a significant difference between assessment for learning and assessment as learning in formative? Explain.